The video had been viewed 2.3 million times in 6 hours. Harrison Blackwood stared at his laptop screen in his downtown Chicago office, watching his 16-year-old daughter, Emma, being mocked by a circle of teenagers at what should have been her high school graduation celebration. The comments section was a cesspool of cruelty that made his hands shake with rage. "Turn it off, Harrison." Marcus Chen, his chief operating officer, reached across the mahogany desk. "Your lawyers are already working on getting it removed." Too late for that. Harrison's voice was hollow as he scrolled through the endless stream of shares, memes, and commentary. Someone had created a remix of Emma's confused dancing, setting it to comedic music. Another account had made her into a reaction GIF. His daughter, his sweet, trusting Emma, had become the internet's latest joke. The office door burst open without warning. Richard Meridian stormed in, his face red with exertion and fury, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Blackwood?" Harrison slowly closed the laptop and looked up at the man whose son had destroyed his daughter's dignity for 15 seconds of viral fame. "I think I'm about to make the biggest decision of my life. You can't be serious about pulling out of our contract. $60 million, Harrison. That's not just money, that's your company's future." "My company?" Harrison stood, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the conference table where their partnership agreement lay waiting for final signatures. "What's a company worth if I have to sell my soul to keep it running?" Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago stretched endlessly under an autumn sky that matched Harrison's mood. Gray, heavy, and threatening storm. 42 floors below, normal people lived normal lives, blissfully unaware that in this glass tower, a father was choosing between financial survival and his daughter's dignity. Marcus cleared his throat. "Harrison, I understand you're upset. We all are. But think about this rationally. Emma's okay, she's safe at home. This will blow over in a week, maybe less. The internet has a short attention span. She hasn't spoken since yesterday." Harrison's words cut through the room like shards of ice. "She won't eat, she won't leave her room. She asked me if she's broken, Marcus. My 16-year-old daughter asked me if God made a mistake when he made her." The silence stretched until Meridian shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Tyler feels terrible about what happened. Kids do stupid things. He's written an apology." "An apology?" Harrison's laugh was bitter. "Your son turned my daughter into a worldwide meme, and you think an apology fixes that? What do you want from me? Tyler's just a kid. He's 18 years old, Richard, old enough to understand that actions have consequences." Harrison moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like against the city backdrop. "But apparently that's not how your family works. When Tyler screws up, Daddy's money makes it disappear. That's not fair." "Fair?" Harrison spun around, his carefully controlled composure finally cracking. "You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what's fair. Fair is my daughter getting to dance at her own graduation without being filmed and humiliated. Fair is her not having to see herself turned into a punchline for millions of strangers. Fair is her not asking me why God made her different if it only brings her pain." The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic 42 floors below. Marcus and Meridian exchanged glances, the weight of Harrison's words settling over them like a funeral shroud. Meridian's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and paled. "The video's at 4 million views now. Someone just sent it to Ellen DeGeneres." Harrison felt something snap inside his chest. Ellen DeGeneres, his daughter's favorite talk show host, the woman Emma watched every afternoon while doing her homework, laughing at the dancing and kindness and joy. Now Ellen would see Emma at her most vulnerable, caught in a moment of cruel mockery. "That's it." Harrison walked to his desk and picked up the phone. "Jennifer, get me Paul Morrison at Channel 7 News. Tell him I want to buy an hour of primetime television. Tonight." Marcus shot to his feet. "Harrison, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done years ago." Harrison's voice was steady now, resolved. "I'm going to tell the world about Emma. The real Emma. Not the version Tyler created for TikTok." Meridian stepped forward, his business instincts kicking in. "You can't be serious. 1 hour of primetime television in Chicago costs $300,000. I know. I can afford it. Think about what you're doing to your company's reputation, to Emma's privacy. Once you put her story out there, you can't take it back." Harrison met Meridian's gaze steadily. "You're right. I can't take it back. Just like Emma can't take back what your son did to her. The difference is, my story will show the world who my daughter really is. Yours just showed them what your son is." The phone rang. Harrison answered without breaking eye contact with Meridian. "Mr. Blackwood? This is Paul Morrison from Channel 7. I understand you want to discuss purchasing television time. I do. I want an hour tonight, prime time, and I want to personally address the audience about a matter of public interest. Sir, that's highly unusual. What exactly... Mr. Morrison, are you familiar with the viral video of a young woman with Down syndrome that's been circulating today? A pause. Yes, sir, it's been trending all afternoon. That's my daughter, and tonight, Chicago is going to hear the whole story. But how had Harrison Blackwood, master of calculated risks and controlled outcomes, reached this moment of absolute moral clarity? The answer stretched back through 16 years of careful choices, protective decisions, and the gradual understanding that love sometimes requires the courage to let go of control. It began in a sterile hospital room where a successful businessman first held his daughter and made promises he didn't yet understand how to keep. Harrison had been 28 when Sarah gave birth to Emma, already well on his way to building the tech empire that would make him one of Chicago's youngest billionaires. Blackwood Technologies had just landed its first major government contract, and Harrison's life was following the precise trajectory he'd mapped out since graduating from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. Success, he'd learned from his own demanding parents, came from controlling variables and eliminating uncertainties. His father, Thomas Blackwood, had built a steel fortune through ruthless efficiency and an intolerance for weakness. His mother, Eleanor, had maintained their social status through careful image management and strategic connections. Together, they'd raised Harrison to believe that perfection was not just achievable, but mandatory, which made Emma's diagnosis 3 days after her birth feel like a fundamental failure of planning. Down syndrome occurs in approximately 1 in 700 births, Dr. Martinez had explained gently, as Harrison and Sarah absorbed the news that would reshape their understanding of everything. It's completely random, not caused by anything you did or didn't do during pregnancy. Emma will face some challenges, but with proper support, children with Down syndrome can lead fulfilling lives. Harrison's first instinct had been to research solutions. Surely there were experimental treatments, cutting-edge therapies, or specialists who could minimize the impact of Emma's condition. He spent sleepless nights reading medical journals, contacting researchers and investigating every possible intervention. But Sarah had simply held their daughter and whispered, "She's perfect exactly as she is." It would take Harrison years to understand the wisdom in Sarah's immediate acceptance, and longer still, to recognize that his desire to fix Emma was really about fixing his own discomfort with unpredictability. As Emma grew from infant to toddler, the differences became more apparent. She reached developmental milestones more slowly than other children. Her speech was delayed, her motor skills required extra practice, and social interactions sometimes confused her. But she also displayed an emotional intelligence and capacity for joy that left Harrison constantly amazed. Emma's first word wasn't mama or dada, it was happy, which she said, while clapping her hands and laughing at her own reflection in a mirror. At 18 months, she would comfort other crying children at daycare by offering them her favorite stuffed elephant. By age 3, she could sense Harrison's stress from business calls and would quietly bring him his favorite tea, somehow knowing he needed comfort, even when he hadn't recognized it himself. Sarah embraced these gifts naturally, enrolling Emma in inclusive preschool programs and encouraging her to try everything from swimming lessons to art classes. But Harrison struggled with the balance between nurturing Emma's potential and protecting her from a world that might not appreciate her differences. The first real test came when Emma was 5 and ready to start kindergarten. Sarah wanted her enrolled in their neighborhood public school, arguing that inclusion would benefit both Emma and her typically developing peers. Harrison favored a specialized private program where Emma's needs would be understood and accommodated without question. "She'll thrive in a regular classroom," Sarah insisted during one of their many discussions about Emma's future. Children with Down syndrome often exceed expectations when they're challenged appropriately and supported consistently. But what if she struggles? What if the other kids are cruel? What if the teachers don't have the training to help her? Harrison's concerns weren't unfounded. He'd researched extensively and found troubling statistics about bullying and academic underachievement in inclusive settings. "Then we'll advocate for her," Sarah replied simply. "We'll work with the school, educate the teachers, and teach the other children about acceptance and friendship. Running away from potential problems won't make Emma stronger." They compromised, enrolling Emma in a private school with an inclusion program that served both neurotypical children and those with various learning differences. It was the first of many compromises that would define Emma's educational journey, always slightly more protected than Sarah preferred, but more integrated than Harrison's fears would have chosen. Emma flourished in the program, making friends easily and surprising her teachers with her artistic abilities and emotional insights, but Harrison remained vigilant for signs of rejection or ridicule, ready to intervene at the first hint that Emma might be facing social challenges. His hypervigilance intensified after Sarah's death when Emma was 8 years old. The cancer had come suddenly and aggressively, giving them only 6 months from diagnosis to devastating loss. In those final weeks, as Sarah grew weaker and Emma struggled to understand why Mommy couldn't play anymore, Harrison watched his wife demonstrate a grace and acceptance that he envied but couldn't replicate. "Promise me you won't let fear make Emma's world smaller," Sarah had whispered during one of their last conversations alone. "She's going to face challenges because of her disability, but she's also going to change lives because of who she is. Don't rob the world of that gift by keeping her hidden," Harrison had promised, but grief and single parenthood had made that promise harder to keep than he'd anticipated. Without Sarah's natural instinct for inclusion, Harrison defaulted to protection. He transferred Emma to an even more specialized school. He limited her social activities to structured, supervised environments. He hired therapists and tutors and advocates to create a carefully controlled world where Emma could succeed without risking failure or rejection. By the time Emma turned 12, Harrison had constructed what felt like a perfect bubble around his daughter. She was thriving academically within the modified curricula designed for her learning style. She had friends among other children with similar challenges. She pursued her interests in art and music in safe, supportive environments where her differences were understood and celebrated. But the bubble began to feel like a prison as Emma grew older and more aware of the broader world beyond her carefully curated experiences. "Why don't I go to the same school as the kids in our neighborhood?" she'd asked one evening as they walked along Lake Michigan. She was 13 then, increasingly observant about the discrepancies between her life and those of her typically developing peers. "Your school has special programs for kids with learning differences," Harrison had explained carefully. "The teachers there understand how to help you learn in the way that works best for you. But I'm not stupid, Daddy. I know I learn slower sometimes, but I could still go to regular school if I had help, right?" The question had pierced Harrison's heart because it revealed Emma's growing awareness that her separate education wasn't just about accommodation, it was about limitation. She was beginning to understand that the world had been divided into normal and special, and she'd been placed firmly in the latter category. That night, Harrison had called Dr. Patricia Williams, the developmental pediatrician who'd been working with Emma since early childhood. Dr. Williams had become not just Emma's doctor, but Harrison's trusted advisor in navigating the complex decisions that came with raising a child with intellectual disabilities. "Emma's asking questions about inclusion," Harrison explained. "She wants to know why she can't go to regular school, why her social activities are always with other kids who have disabilities. I've been protecting her from potential rejection, but I'm starting to wonder if I'm also protecting her from opportunities." Dr. Williams had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "Harrison, Emma is approaching adolescence, which means she's developing a stronger sense of identity and a natural desire for independence. If she's expressing interest in more inclusive experiences, that's actually a positive sign of her growing self-advocacy skills. But what if she gets hurt? What if kids are cruel to her? What if they're not?" Dr. Williams had challenged gently. "What if Emma's presence in their lives teaches them about acceptance and friendship? What if her courage to be herself in a neurotypical world inspires other kids to embrace their own differences?" The conversation had planted seeds of doubt about Harrison's protective approach, but it would take 3 more years and a viral video to finally convince him that his fear-based parenting was limiting Emma rather than protecting her. The transition to Lakeshore Academy had been Harrison's attempt at compromise between protection and inclusion. The elite private school served primarily neurotypical students, but had a small program for high-achieving students with learning differences. Emma would be included in regular classes with support from specialized teachers, allowing her to experience mainstream education while still receiving the accommodations she needed. Harrison had toured the facility extensively, interviewed every teacher Emma would work with, and negotiated a detailed support plan that covered everything from modified testing to social skills coaching. He'd felt confident that he'd found the perfect balance, challenging enough to help Emma grow, but structured enough to prevent the kind of social disasters that haunted his imagination. What he hadn't anticipated was how much Emma herself would change during her high school years. At 16, Emma had developed a strong sense of her own identity and capabilities. She was an accomplished artist whose work had been displayed in several local galleries. She volunteered regularly at the animal shelter, where her gentle manner with traumatized animals had earned her recognition as their most effective volunteer. She participated in Special Olympics swimming and had medaled in several regional competitions. But most importantly, Emma had developed genuine friendships with both disabled and non-disabled peers, relationships that transcended the careful supervision Harrison had once insisted upon. She texted constantly with her friend Madison, a neurotypical classmate who shared Emma's love of romantic comedies and celebrity gossip. She collaborated on art projects with James, another student with Down syndrome who attended through Lakeshore's inclusion program. She had a complicated but affectionate relationship with her assigned peer mentor, Sarah Chen, Marcus's daughter, who had initially volunteered for community service hours but had genuinely grown to cherish Emma's friendship. Watching Emma navigate these relationships had slowly convinced Harrison that his daughter was far more socially capable than he'd given her credit for. She could advocate for herself when misunderstood, offer comfort to friends facing typical teenage challenges, and maintain boundaries when people treated her condescendingly. The graduation ceremony had been meant to celebrate these achievements. Emma's successful completion of Lakeshore's modified diploma program and her preparation for the next phase of her life, which would include continuing her art education at a local community college and expanding her volunteer work. Harrison had arrived at the ceremony feeling proud and optimistic about Emma's future. For the first time in years, he'd allowed himself to believe that maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe Emma could thrive in the broader world without constant protection. That optimism had lasted exactly 43 minutes until Tyler Meridian's phone captured Emma dancing and transformed her moment of joy into a source of global entertainment. The viral spread of the video had been swift and merciless. Within the first hour, Tyler's TikTok post had been shared across multiple platforms. Twitter users added commentary ranging from mean-spirited jokes to concerned criticism of Tyler's behavior. Instagram accounts reposted the video with their own captions. Facebook groups dedicated to viral content picked it up, generating thousands of comments and reactions. By morning, major entertainment blogs were covering the story, typically framing it as either cruel teenager mocks disabled classmate or heartwarming dancing goes viral. Both narratives reduced Emma to a symbol rather than a person, which infuriated Harrison almost as much as the original mockery. Emma's reaction to seeing herself become internet famous had been devastating to witness. She'd spent the first day convinced that everyone was laughing with her, excited that so many people had seen her dancing. It wasn't until she read some of the comments that she understood the true nature of her viral fame. "Daddy, why are people saying I look weird when I dance?" she'd asked, her voice small and confused. "I thought dancing was supposed to make people happy." Harrison had struggled to explain the cruelty of strangers, the way some people found entertainment in mocking what they didn't understand. But how could he help Emma comprehend something that he himself found incomprehensible? The most painful part had been watching Emma's self-confidence crumble as she read comment after comment, questioning her intelligence, mocking her appearance, and treating her as a curiosity rather than a person. For 16 years, Harrison had worked to build Emma's sense of self-worth and belonging. Tyler's video had threatened to undo all of that progress in a matter of hours. That's when Harrison had realized that his years of protection had been fundamentally misguided. He'd been so focused on preventing Emma from experiencing rejection that he'd failed to prepare her for the reality that rejection was inevitable. More importantly, he'd failed to equip her with the tools she needed to face that rejection with dignity and strength. But Emma, in her characteristic way, had surprised him. After the initial shock and hurt, she'd asked Harrison a question that changed his entire perspective. "Daddy, do you think Tyler knows any people like me? Like, really knows them, not just sees them sometimes?" The question revealed Emma's intuitive understanding that Tyler's cruelty likely stemmed from ignorance rather than genuine malice. While Harrison was plotting revenge and legal action, Emma was wondering if education might be more effective than punishment. "I don't think he does, sweetheart," Harrison had admitted, "and that's probably why he thought it was okay to make fun of you. Maybe if he got to know someone like me, he wouldn't think we were funny anymore." Emma had suggested, with the kind of wisdom that left Harrison speechless. It was that conversation that had planted the seed for Harrison's decision to purchase television time rather than simply pursue legal action. Emma's insight had shown him that this moment could be about more than protecting one teenager. It could be about changing how society saw people with intellectual disabilities. The hours leading up to Harrison's television appearance had been a whirlwind of preparation and second-guessing. Paul Morrison at Channel 7 had been initially skeptical about Harrison's request, but the story's viral nature and Harrison's willingness to pay premium rates had quickly overcome any reservations. Within 6 hours, they'd cleared the evening schedule and assembled a production team for what Morrison was calling the most unusual broadcast in Chicago television history. Harrison had spent the afternoon writing and rewriting his remarks, trying to balance his fury at Tyler and the Meridians with his genuine desire to create positive change. Emma had insisted on helping, offering suggestions about what aspects of her life she wanted people to understand. "Tell them about my art," she'd said as they worked together in Harrison's home office. "And tell them about how I help at the animal shelter. Tell them I'm not just my disability. I'm a whole person with interests and talents and feelings." "I will, sweetheart. I'll tell them everything that makes you special. But also tell them about the hard parts," Emma had added, demonstrating the emotional maturity that never failed to amaze Harrison. "Tell them that sometimes I do need extra help, and that's okay. Tell them that being different doesn't mean being less than, but it also doesn't mean pretending differences don't exist." Emma's ability to articulate the complexity of her experience had helped Harrison understand what his television appearance needed to accomplish. It wasn't enough to simply defend Emma or attack Tyler. He needed to help viewers see people with intellectual disabilities as complete human beings worthy of respect, inclusion, and genuine relationship. Marcus had spent the afternoon fielding calls from business partners, investors, and board members who'd gotten wind of Harrison's planned broadcast. The consensus was overwhelmingly negative. Most urged Harrison to handle the situation privately to avoid damaging Blackwood Technologies' reputation. "The Meridian contract represents 60% of our annual revenue," Marcus had reminded Harrison one final time as they prepared to leave for the television studio. "Are you absolutely certain you're prepared to lose that?" "I'm certain I was never going to keep it," Harrison had replied. "Not at the cost of my daughter's dignity. Some things are more valuable than money, Marcus." But even as Harrison spoke those words, he'd felt the weight of responsibility for his company's 300 employees, many of whom had families depending on their paychecks. Was it fair to risk their livelihoods for a matter of principle? Was he being courageously moral or irresponsibly impulsive? The doubt had followed him into the television studio, where he'd sat alone at a simple desk, looking directly into a camera that would broadcast his words to millions of viewers. In that moment, with the red recording light glowing like an accusation, Harrison had questioned every decision that had brought him to this point. Then he'd thought about Emma asking if she was broken, and the doubt had evaporated. The response to Harrison's television appearance had been immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from enthusiastic support to harsh criticism. Parents of children with disabilities shared their own stories of discrimination and inclusion challenges. Teachers posted about the importance of acceptance education in schools. Business leaders debated the ethics of Harrison's decision to sacrifice a lucrative contract for personal principles. But the most significant response came from unexpected sources. Within hours of the broadcast, Harrison's office began receiving calls from companies interested in partnering with Blackwood Technologies, specifically because of his demonstrated commitment to social responsibility. Venture capital firms that specialized in ethical investing reached out about funding expansion. Non-profit organizations proposed collaboration opportunities. "It's like you've accidentally created a new business model," Marcus observed the next morning as they reviewed the flood of incoming opportunities. "Companies want to work with us because you chose principles over profit." But Harrison's attention was focused on a different kind of response: the personal messages from families affected by intellectual disabilities. A mother from Milwaukee wrote, "My son has autism, and watching your speech gave me hope that someday he'll have an advocate like you in the business world." A teacher from Detroit shared, "I'm showing your broadcast to my students to help them understand how their words can hurt or heal their classmates with special needs." A college student with Down syndrome emailed, "Emma is so lucky to have a dad who isn't ashamed of her." My parents still won't let me tell people about my disability because they think it will hold me back. That last message had particularly struck Harrison because it revealed how many families were still operating from the same fear-based approach he'd used for years. How many other parents were inadvertently teaching their children that their disabilities were sources of shame rather than simply aspects of their identity. Emma had been monitoring the responses too, reading every positive message with growing excitement and confidence. For the first time since the viral video, she was seeing herself reflected in media coverage as a complete person rather than an object of pity or mockery. "Daddy, look at this," she'd said, showing Harrison her phone. "This lady says I inspired her daughter to try out for her school's art club, even though she has cerebral palsy and was scared people would make fun of her artwork." Harrison had felt a surge of pride and purpose, unlike anything he'd experienced in his business career. Making money was satisfying, but knowing that Emma's story was helping other young people embrace their own potential was genuinely transformative. Tyler Meridian's response to Harrison's television challenge had been predictably reluctant. Faced with the choice between a year of community service or potential legal action that could affect his college admissions and future opportunities, Tyler had chosen compliance over confrontation. But his initial approach to volunteer work had been clearly motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. His first Instagram post about volunteering at Special Olympics had been stilted and obviously coached. "Starting my community service today. Looking forward to learning about people with intellectual disabilities and how I can be a better ally." Harrison had monitored Tyler's social media carefully, looking for signs of authentic engagement rather than performative compliance. The turning point came 6 weeks into Tyler's volunteer commitment when he posted a photo of himself and a young man with Down syndrome named Marcus, who had just won a gold medal in basketball shooting. "Marcus scored 15 out of 20 free throws today, which is better than I've ever done," Tyler had written. "He's been practicing for 8 months to get ready for regionals." Watching him celebrate after hitting that 15th shot reminded me why sports matter, not because of who wins or loses, but because of how hard work and determination can make you feel about yourself. Marcus didn't need my help to succeed. He just needed someone to believe in him and give him the chance to show what he could do. The post had been shared thousands of times, with comments praising Tyler's apparent growth and understanding. But more importantly for Harrison, it suggested that Tyler was beginning to see people with intellectual disabilities as individuals with their own goals and capabilities rather than objects of charity or mockery. Emma had been following Tyler's volunteer work too, and her response had been characteristically generous. "I think he's really learning, Daddy," she'd said after reading Tyler's latest posts about his Special Olympics experience. "Maybe we should invite him to visit the animal shelter where I volunteer. I bet he'd like to see how good I am at helping scared dogs feel safe." Harrison had been amazed by Emma's readiness to forgive and include Tyler, despite the pain he'd caused her. It was yet another reminder that Emma's emotional intelligence often exceeded his own, and that her instinct for redemption rather than revenge was probably the wiser approach. The establishment of the Emma Blackwood Foundation had required months of legal and logistical work. Harrison had initially envisioned a simple scholarship fund for students with intellectual disabilities, but conversations with disability rights advocates had convinced him that systemic change required more comprehensive intervention. The Foundation's mission had evolved to encompass 3 primary goals: educational inclusion advocacy, employment opportunity development, and public awareness campaigns about the capabilities and contributions of people with intellectual disabilities. Dr. Patricia Williams had agreed to serve as the Foundation's clinical advisor, helping design programs that would actually meet the needs of the disability community rather than simply reflecting well-intentioned assumptions about what that community needed. "The most important thing to remember," Dr. Williams had explained during one of their planning meetings, "is that people with intellectual disabilities are the experts on their own experiences. Any program we create needs to center their voices and priorities, not what we think would be good for them." This philosophy had led to the Foundation's decision to establish an advisory board composed entirely of individuals with intellectual disabilities, including Emma as the youngest member. The board would review all program proposals and funding decisions, ensuring that the Foundation's work remained relevant and responsive to community needs. Emma had taken her board responsibilities seriously, attending meetings with prepared notes and thoughtful questions about proposed initiatives. Her contributions had been invaluable in shaping programs that reflected real-world challenges and opportunities. We should have a program that teaches people without disabilities how to be friends with people like me, Emma had suggested during one board meeting. Not like volunteers or helpers, but real friends who just like spending time together. That suggestion had led to the Foundation's Friendship Initiative, which paired neurotypical teens with peers who had intellectual disabilities for social activities designed around shared interests rather than disability-focused programming. The program's pilot launch had been remarkably successful, creating genuine friendships that extended beyond the structured activities into natural social connections. Participating families reported increased understanding and acceptance, while teenagers with intellectual disabilities gained confidence in social situations and expanded their peer networks. Harrison had watched Emma participate in the friendship program with a mixture of pride and regret. Seeing her natural ability to connect with neurotypical peers made him wonder how many friendships she might have formed earlier if he'd been less protective and more trusting of her social capabilities. The See Me First Employment Initiative had proven to be the Foundation's most challenging and impactful program. Corporate America's track record on disability inclusion was dismal, with fewer than 20% of people with intellectual disabilities employed in competitive jobs, despite many being capable of meaningful work with appropriate support. Harrison had leveraged his business connections and reputation to convince companies to commit to inclusive hiring practices, but he'd quickly learned that good intentions weren't enough to create sustainable change. Many businesses expressed enthusiasm about hiring people with disabilities, but lacked the knowledge and resources to provide appropriate accommodations and support. Others worried about productivity, liability, and customer reactions to employees who might communicate or behave differently than neurotypical workers. The Foundation had responded by developing comprehensive support services for both employers and employees. They provided job coaching for individuals with intellectual disabilities, workplace accommodation consulting for businesses, and ongoing support to ensure successful long-term placements. Emma had become one of the program's most effective advocates, visiting participating companies to share her own experiences and capabilities. Her presentations were typically more impactful than Harrison's formal business pitches because she could speak directly to the concerns and misconceptions that many employers harbored about workers with intellectual disabilities. "I know I learn new things more slowly than some people," Emma would explain to groups of managers and HR professionals. "But once I learn something, I never forget it. And I notice details that other people miss because I pay attention differently than they do. Plus, I'm always happy to be at work because I'm grateful for the chance to contribute and be part of a team." These presentations had led to dozens of successful job placements, from office assistants to retail associates to food service workers. The participating companies consistently reported high levels of satisfaction with their employees with intellectual disabilities, citing reliability, attention to detail, and positive attitudes as standout qualities. But perhaps more importantly, the program was changing workplace culture in participating companies. Neurotypical employees reported increased awareness of disability issues, greater appreciation for different communication styles, and enhanced understanding of inclusion and accommodation principles. The Legal Fund for Disability Discrimination Cases had become the Foundation's most controversial initiative. Harrison had originally conceived of it as a way to help families who lacked the resources to pursue justice when their children faced discrimination or harassment. But the fund had quickly attracted cases involving employment discrimination, educational exclusion, and accessibility violations that affected the broader disability community. The fund's first major case had involved a restaurant chain that had fired 3 employees with intellectual disabilities, claiming they were too slow and made customers uncomfortable. The employees had been working successfully for months before a new manager decided they were incompatible with the company's fast-paced, customer-focused environment. Harrison's legal team had documented that the fired employees had performance evaluations equal to or better than their neurotypical colleagues, and that customer complaints about their service were virtually non-existent. The case had ultimately settled for significant financial compensation and a company-wide commitment to inclusive hiring and management practices. "This is about more than individual justice," Harrison had explained to critics who questioned the Foundation's aggressive legal approach. "We're establishing precedents that will protect other people with disabilities from similar discrimination. Sometimes the only way to change systemic problems is through consequences that affect the bottom line. The Legal Fund had handled 17 cases in its first year, winning or settling 15 of them. More importantly, news coverage of these cases had raised awareness about disability discrimination and encouraged other individuals and families to report violations rather than accepting them as inevitable. Emma had been particularly proud of a case involving a young woman with Down syndrome who had been excluded from her high school's honor society despite meeting all academic requirements. The school had claimed that her intellectual disability made her incompatible with the honor society's mission of recognizing academic excellence. "That's exactly what people used to say about me," Emma had told Harrison after they'd won the case and secured the student's admission to the honor society. "They thought that having Down syndrome meant I couldn't be smart or successful, but I am smart, just in different ways than some people." 2 years after Harrison's television appearance, the family dynamic between Harrison and Emma had fundamentally shifted. Where Harrison had once made decisions about Emma's life based on his own assessment of what was safe and appropriate, Emma now played a central role in shaping her own future. She had developed strong self-advocacy skills, clear preferences about her goals and activities, and the confidence to express disagreement when she felt Harrison was being overly protective. "I want to live in my own apartment when I turn 18, Emma had announced during dinner one evening. "Madison is going to college, but I want to stay in Chicago and keep working at the animal shelter and doing my art. I can take some classes at the community college, and I want to live independently like other adults." Harrison's first instinct had been to list all the potential challenges and risks of independent living for someone with intellectual disabilities. But he'd caught himself before voicing those concerns, remembering how his protective instincts had limited Emma's growth in the past. "Tell me more about what you're thinking," he'd said instead. "What would independent living look like for you?" Emma had clearly thought about this extensively. She'd researched supported living programs for adults with intellectual disabilities, identified potential roommates through her social networks, and even visited several apartment complexes that offered the accessibility features and community supports she would need. "I don't want to live alone because I like having people around," she'd explained, "but I want to make my own decisions about what I eat and when I go to bed and how I spend my free time. I want to prove to myself that I can take care of myself, even if I sometimes need help with complicated things." The conversation had led to 6 months of planning and preparation, including life skills training, financial literacy education, and gradual increases in Emma's independence and decision-making authority. Harrison had struggled with every aspect of the process, but Dr. Williams had helped him understand that supporting Emma's autonomy was ultimately an expression of love rather than neglect. "Emma is telling you that she's ready for the next stage of her development," Dr. Williams had explained. "Your job as her father is to help her succeed in that transition, not to prevent it from happening." Emma's move to a supported living apartment had been one of the most difficult and rewarding experiences of Harrison's life. Watching his daughter take responsibility for her own meals, transportation, and daily routines had forced him to confront how much he'd underestimated her capabilities. But it had also revealed new aspects of Emma's personality that had been suppressed by his protective approach. Living independently had made Emma more confident, more creative, and more socially engaged. She'd developed friendships with her neighbors, taken on leadership roles in her volunteer work, and begun selling her artwork through local galleries and online platforms. The broader impact of Harrison's decision to go public with Emma's story had extended far beyond their personal lives. The viral video that had once seemed like a catastrophe had ultimately become a catalyst for national conversations about disability rights, inclusion practices, and the power of authentic storytelling to change hearts and minds. Emma had been invited to speak at conferences, schools, and corporate events across the country. Her presentations were typically more effective than traditional disability awareness programs because she spoke from lived experience rather than academic theory, and because her obvious intelligence and articulate communication challenged stereotypes about people with intellectual disabilities. "People always seem surprised that I can answer their questions and talk about complicated topics," Emma had observed, after speaking at a medical conference about patient-centered care for people with disabilities. "I think they expect me to be like a little kid who needs someone else to speak for me. But I'm 17 now, and I have my own thoughts and opinions about things." Harrison had watched these speaking engagements with a mixture of pride and amazement. Emma's ability to educate audiences about disability issues while simultaneously demonstrating her own capabilities was changing minds in ways that traditional advocacy approaches often couldn't achieve. The ripple effects had been measurable. Schools that hosted Emma's presentations reported increased inclusion in student activities and decreased incidents of disability-based bullying. Companies that heard her speak about employment often reached out to the foundation about hiring initiatives. Medical professionals who attended her conferences implemented more respectful communication practices with patients who had intellectual disabilities. But perhaps most importantly, other families affected by intellectual disabilities had begun sharing their own stories publicly, inspired by the positive reception Emma had received. Harrison received dozens of emails from parents who had decided to stop hiding their children's disabilities after seeing how advocacy could lead to acceptance rather than rejection. Support groups for families of children with Down syndrome reported increased membership and engagement. Online communities dedicated to disability pride and self-advocacy had grown exponentially. Emma's courage to be herself in public gave other people permission to do the same, Dr. Williams had observed during one of their regular check-ins. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "This is who I am, and I belong here," to give others the confidence to do the same. The transformation in Tyler Meridian had been perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire situation. What had begun as court-mandated community service had evolved into genuine passion for disability advocacy. Tyler's year of volunteer work had stretched into ongoing involvement with multiple organizations, serving people with intellectual disabilities. His social media presence had shifted from typical teenage content to thoughtful posts about inclusion, accessibility, and the misconceptions he'd held before beginning his volunteer work. He'd become a powerful voice for peer education, speaking to other teenagers about the impact of casual cruelty and the importance of treating all people with dignity. "I used to think that people with disabilities were sad or broken," Tyler had written in a blog post that had been shared thousands of times. "I made Emma's video because I thought she looked funny dancing, and I wanted other people to laugh at her too. I didn't see her as a real person with feelings and dreams and talents. I saw her as entertainment." Tyler's willingness to publicly acknowledge his past cruelty and detail his process of learning and growth had made him an effective advocate precisely because his audience could identify with his former ignorance. "Most teenagers don't start out being intentionally cruel to people with disabilities," he'd explained during a presentation at his former high school. "They just don't think of them as real people whose feelings can be hurt. I thought Emma was different from me in every way that mattered, but spending time with people with intellectual disabilities taught me that we're actually similar in most ways that matter. We all want to be accepted, to have friends, to feel useful and valued." Tyler's advocacy work had earned him recognition from several national disability rights organizations, but more importantly, it had led to a genuine friendship with Emma that had surprised everyone involved. Emma had been initially hesitant about Tyler's requests to stay in touch after completing his volunteer commitment, but their shared interest in animal welfare had provided common ground for building trust. "Tyler really understands animals now," Emma had told Harrison after they'd volunteered together at a dog adoption event. "He learned how to be patient with scared dogs the same way he learned how to be patient with people like me. I think he's a better person now than he was before." Harrison had struggled with Emma's willingness to forgive Tyler and include him in her life, but he'd gradually come to appreciate the wisdom in her approach. Tyler's transformation was more complete and lasting because it had been based on relationship rather than punishment, education rather than isolation. The second anniversary of the viral video had been marked by a celebration that would have been unimaginable when the crisis first erupted. Channel 7 had invited Harrison and Emma back for a follow-up broadcast, documenting the changes that had occurred in their lives and the broader impact of their story on disability awareness and inclusion practices. But instead of Harrison speaking alone, the program featured Emma as the primary presenter, with Harrison playing a supporting role. Emma had prepared extensively for the appearance, working with a communication coach to develop her presentation skills while maintaining her authentic voice and perspective. 2 years ago, a video of me dancing went viral because someone thought it was funny to watch a person with Down syndrome try to dance, Emma began, speaking directly to the camera with confidence that would have amazed viewers who remembered her father's original broadcast. That video hurt my feelings and made me feel ashamed of who I am, but it also started a conversation that changed my life and my family's life in ways I never could have imagined. Emma had gone on to discuss the foundation's work, her own advocacy activities, and the broader changes she'd observed in how society talked about and treated people with intellectual disabilities. "I still have Down syndrome, and that's not going to change," she'd explained. "But what has changed is how many people see me as a whole person instead of just a disability. I have talents and interests and opinions just like everyone else. I also need extra help with some things, and that's okay too. What matters is that people treat me with respect and give me chances to show what I can do." The broadcast had concluded with Emma's announcement of her next major project, a book combining her artwork with essays about her experiences growing up with Down syndrome in a world that often didn't know how to see her. "I want other kids with disabilities to know that they don't have to hide who they are," Emma had said. "And I want people without disabilities to understand that we have just as much to offer as anyone else. We just might offer it in different ways." The book project had become a family collaboration that strengthened Harrison and Emma's relationship in unexpected ways. Emma's essays were honest and insightful, covering topics from her early awareness of being different to her current aspirations for independent living and meaningful work. But they also revealed aspects of her experience that Harrison had never fully understood. "I used to think Daddy was ashamed of me," Emma had written in one essay about their family's journey toward inclusion. "He was always so worried about what other people would think, and he never wanted me to be in places where people might stare at me or ask questions about my disability. I thought that meant he wished I was different." Reading Emma's perspective on his protective approach had been painful for Harrison, but it had also helped him understand how his well-intentioned efforts to shield her from rejection had inadvertently communicated that she was something to be ashamed of. "Now I know that Daddy was scared of seeing me get hurt, not scared of me being different," Emma's essay continued. "But I wish he had known sooner that I'm strong enough to handle people who don't understand me. I'm also smart enough to know the difference between people who are trying to help me and people who are trying to hurt me." Working together on the book had given Harrison and Emma opportunities for conversations about their shared experiences that they'd never had before. Emma's insights into her own development and needs had helped Harrison understand how much he'd missed by making assumptions rather than asking questions. "I never realized how much you understood about the social dynamics around your disability," Harrison had admitted during one of their editing sessions. "I thought I was protecting you from awareness that would hurt you, but you were already aware and just needed support in dealing with that awareness." "I've always known I was different," Emma had replied. "What I needed to learn was that different doesn't mean wrong or less than. That's what you helped me understand when you went on TV and told everyone you were proud of me." The book had been published by a major publishing house, with proceeds supporting the foundation's work and Emma's future independent living goals. But beyond its financial success, the book had become a resource for families, educators, and communities seeking to better understand and support people with intellectual disabilities. 5 years after the viral video, Harrison reflected on how profoundly his understanding of fatherhood and success had changed. His business had not only survived the loss of the Meridian contract, but had thrived under a new model that prioritized social responsibility alongside profitability. Blackwood Technologies had become known as an industry leader in inclusive hiring practices, accessible design, and ethical business principles. The foundation had grown into a national organization with programs in 12 states, but its focus remained on the grassroots community building and individual advocacy that had characterized its early work. Emma served as its youth advisory chair, bringing the perspectives of young adults with intellectual disabilities to all major policy and program decisions. But the changes that mattered most to Harrison were personal rather than professional. Emma had achieved the independent living goal she'd set for herself, sharing an apartment with 2 roommates and managing her own schedule, finances, and social life with minimal support. She continued her volunteer work at the animal shelter, had developed a thriving art career, and had begun taking college courses in animal behavior and therapy techniques. More importantly, Emma had become a confident self-advocate who could articulate her needs, set boundaries with people who treated her condescendingly, and navigate complex social situations with grace and wisdom. "I'm proud of how far you've come," Harrison had told her during dinner at her apartment, a monthly tradition they'd maintained since she'd moved out. "I'm proud of how far we've both come," Emma had replied. "You learned how to let me be myself, and I learned how to be myself even when other people don't understand me." The relationship between father and daughter had evolved into something closer to partnership, with Emma playing an active role in family decisions and Harrison consulting her perspective on both personal and professional challenges. "What do you think about the Foundation's proposal to expand into employment training programs?" Harrison had asked during their dinner conversation. Emma had considered the question seriously, as she always did when asked for her input on Foundation business. "I think it's good, but we need to make sure we're training employers too, not just employees," she'd said. "A lot of people with disabilities already know how to work hard. What they need is bosses who know how to see their strengths, instead of just focusing on what they can't do." Emma's insights consistently surprised Harrison with their sophistication and practical wisdom. Her understanding of disability issues was informed by lived experience, but also by years of advocacy work and community engagement that had broadened her perspective beyond her own circumstances. The impact on the broader disability rights movement had been significant, but also complicated. Harrison's story had undoubtedly raised awareness about the capabilities and contributions of people with intellectual disabilities, but it had also reinforced some problematic narratives about disability requiring extraordinary advocacy to be valued. "We have to be careful not to suggest that people with disabilities only deserve respect when they have rich, powerful fathers willing to fight for them," Dr. Williams had cautioned during a Foundation board meeting. Emma's story is inspiring, but it shouldn't be the only way we imagine people with disabilities achieving inclusion and recognition. This concern had led the Foundation to prioritize supporting family advocates from diverse economic and cultural backgrounds, ensuring that their programs were accessible to communities that couldn't purchase television time or hire legal teams. Emma had been particularly insistent that the Foundation's work include people with intellectual disabilities who didn't have the advantages of supportive families, quality education, or economic resources. "Not everyone with Down syndrome has a dad like mine," she'd said during a board presentation about the Foundation's outreach priorities. "Some people's families don't understand their disability, or they live in places where there aren't good programs, or they don't have money for the extra help they need. Those are the people who need our support the most." This perspective had shaped the Foundation's decision to focus heavily on public education and systemic change rather than individual advocacy. By working to change attitudes, policies, and practices at the institutional level, they hoped to create environments where all people with intellectual disabilities could thrive, regardless of their family circumstances. The relationship between Harrison and Richard Meridian had remained strained but had evolved in unexpected directions. Meridian had initially responded to the loss of the Blackwood contract with anger and legal threats, claiming that Harrison had violated confidentiality agreements and damaged Meridian Industries' reputation through his television appearance. But the overwhelmingly positive public response to Harrison's advocacy had made Meridian's position increasingly untenable. Attempting to punish a father for defending his daughter with a disability had proven to be a public relations nightmare that had cost Meridian Industries several other significant contracts. The turning point had come when Tyler's volunteer work began receiving national attention, creating positive coverage for the Meridian family that had helped repair their damaged reputation. "I owe you an apology," Meridian had said during an unexpected phone call to Harrison 2 years after their initial confrontation. "Tyler's volunteer work has taught me things about people with disabilities that I should have known years ago. More importantly, it's taught me things about my own prejudices that I wasn't comfortable acknowledging." The conversation had led to Meridian Industries' decision to partner with the Foundation on inclusive hiring initiatives, becoming one of the program's most successful corporate participants. "It's ironic," Harrison had observed to Emma after signing the partnership agreement. "Defending you from Richard's son ultimately led to Richard becoming one of our strongest allies in the business community. Maybe that's how change really happens," Emma had replied. "People don't usually change their minds because someone tells them they're wrong. They change because they have experiences that help them see things differently." Emma's insight had proven accurate in numerous other situations where initial conflict had ultimately led to unexpected partnerships and understanding. The long-term implications of Emma's story had extended into policy and legal precedent in ways that neither Harrison nor Emma had initially anticipated. The Foundation's legal work had contributed to several important court decisions that strengthened protections against disability discrimination in educational and employment settings. The See Me First employment initiative had influenced federal legislation, providing tax incentives for businesses that hired people with intellectual disabilities. Emma's speaking and advocacy work had been cited in congressional testimony about the importance of inclusive education and community-based support services for people with intellectual disabilities. But perhaps most significantly, the cultural conversation that had begun with Harrison's television appearance had contributed to measurable changes in public attitudes about intellectual disability. Polling data showed increased support for inclusive education, employment opportunities, and independent living services for people with intellectual disabilities. Media representation of people with intellectual disabilities had become more frequent and more respectful, moving away from stereotypes of eternal childhood or tragic inspiration. "We've helped change the conversation," Emma had observed during a Foundation strategic planning session. "But we need to make sure the conversation leads to real changes in how people with disabilities are treated every day, not just how people talk about us." Emma's point reflected a growing sophistication in her understanding of advocacy and social change that impressed everyone who worked with her. As Harrison approached his 60th birthday, he often reflected on the unpredictable journey that had led from a moment of crisis to a life of purpose and meaning. The viral video that had once seemed like a catastrophe had ultimately become the catalyst for the most important work of his life. Building a business empire had been satisfying, but creating opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities felt like the contribution he wanted to be remembered for. Emma, now 21, had become a nationally recognized advocate whose speaking, writing, and artistic work influenced policymakers, educators, and families across the country. But more importantly to Harrison, she had become a confident, independent young woman who knew her own worth and insisted that others recognize it too. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Tyler hadn't made that video?" Emma had asked during one of their monthly dinners. Harrison had considered the question seriously. "I think you would have found other ways to make a difference in the world. You might have gotten there more gradually, but your compassion and wisdom would have created opportunities for impact regardless. But would you have learned to stop being scared of what people thought about me?" The question had pierced to the heart of Harrison's personal transformation. "Probably not as quickly. I might have spent years more trying to protect you from experiences that would have helped you grow." "I'm glad Tyler made the video," Emma had said, surprising Harrison with her perspective. "Not because it was fun to be laughed at, but because it gave us a chance to show people that families like ours exist and that people like me deserve respect. If he hadn't done something so obviously wrong, you might never have had a reason to do something so obviously right." Emma's ability to find purpose and meaning in experiences that had initially caused her pain continued to amaze Harrison. Her resilience wasn't just emotional, it was philosophical, grounded in a deep understanding that difficulties could become opportunities if approached with the right perspective. The Foundation's work had expanded internationally, with programs in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia that adapted the See Me First model to different cultural and legal contexts. Emma had traveled to several of these international sites, sharing her experiences and learning from self-advocates in other countries who were working towards similar goals of inclusion and recognition. People with intellectual disabilities face similar challenges everywhere, Emma had reported after a speaking tour in Europe. But they also have similar strengths and dreams everywhere. What changes is how much support they get from their communities and governments to achieve those dreams. These international experiences had broadened Emma's perspective on disability rights as a global movement, while reinforcing her commitment to local community building and individual relationship development. "Big policy changes are important," she'd explained to a group of Foundation donors. "But what really changes lives is when people with and without disabilities become real friends who see each other as whole people. You can't legislate friendship, but you can create opportunities for it to happen." Emma's focus on relationship building had influenced the Foundation's programmatic priorities, leading to increased investment in social inclusion initiatives rather than just educational and employment programs. The question of Harrison's legacy had become more complex as the Foundation's work grew and evolved. While his business success had been impressive, Harrison increasingly saw his role in Emma's advocacy as his most significant contribution to the world. But Emma herself had begun to challenge that narrative, insisting that her achievements were her own rather than reflections of her father's support. "People always want to give you credit for my success," Emma had told Harrison during a conversation about a magazine profile that had focused more on his advocacy than her accomplishments. "But I'm the one who learned to speak in public, and I'm the one who writes the essays, and I'm the one who makes the art. You helped me get opportunities, but I'm the one who took advantage of them." Emma's insistence on receiving credit for her own achievements had initially made Harrison uncomfortable, as he'd grown accustomed to being seen as the heroic father who defended his daughter's dignity. But he'd gradually come to appreciate that Emma's self-advocacy and independence were perhaps the best measures of his success as a parent. "You're right," he'd told her, after reflecting on her criticism. "I've been part of your story, but you're the author of your own life. I'm proud of the role I've played, but I'm more proud of the person you've become." The relationship between Emma and Tyler had continued to evolve in ways that surprised everyone who knew their history. What had begun as court-mandated interaction had developed into genuine friendship based on shared interests in animal welfare and social justice advocacy. Tyler had become one of Emma's most effective collaborators in peer education work, particularly in reaching teenage audiences who might dismiss messages about inclusion if they came only from adults or people with disabilities. "Tyler understands how teenagers think because he used to think that way," Emma had explained when some foundation board members questioned the wisdom of featuring Tyler prominently in their educational programs. "When he tells kids that making fun of people with disabilities isn't cool, they listen because they know he's not just saying what adults want to hear." Tyler's transformation had been thorough enough that he'd changed his college major to special education and had committed to a career working with people with intellectual disabilities. His journey from cruel teenager to passionate advocate had become a powerful example of the possibility for growth and redemption. "I know I can never undo the hurt I caused Emma," Tyler had written in his college application essay, "but I can spend the rest of my life making sure other people with intellectual disabilities are treated with the dignity and respect that Emma deserved from the beginning." Emma had supported Tyler's college applications by writing a letter of recommendation that demonstrated both forgiveness and genuine friendship. "Tyler made a terrible mistake when he was younger," she'd written, "but he learned from that mistake in ways that made him a better person than he might have been if he'd never made it. He understands what it feels like to be wrong about something important, and that understanding makes him a good advocate for people who are often misunderstood." As Emma approached her 22nd birthday, she had begun planning the next phase of her advocacy work with the same determination that had characterized her father's business career. She wanted to establish a mentorship program that would pair young adults with intellectual disabilities with successful professionals in their areas of interest, creating pathways to careers that had previously been considered unrealistic. "People always assume that people with intellectual disabilities can only do certain kinds of jobs," Emma had explained during a foundation planning meeting. "But lots of us have specific interests and talents that could translate to professional careers if we had the right support and training." Emma's own artistic career had proven the validity of this approach. Her paintings now sold for thousands of dollars, and she'd been commissioned for several major public art installations. But more importantly, her success had opened doors for other artists with intellectual disabilities who had previously been excluded from mainstream gallery representation. Emma's example has changed how the art world thinks about intellectual disability and creativity, said curator Maria Santos, who had featured Emma's work in several exhibitions. "She's demonstrated that having Down syndrome doesn't limit artistic vision or technical skill. It just provides a different perspective that often results in more emotionally powerful work." The success of Emma's artistic career had inspired the foundation to develop more comprehensive support for people with intellectual disabilities who wanted to pursue careers in creative fields, professional athletics, entrepreneurship, and other areas that required individualized training and advocacy. The story that had begun with a moment of cruelty had ultimately become a testament to the transformative power of authentic relationship and courageous advocacy. Harrison's decision to defend Emma publicly had created ripple effects that had touched thousands of lives, changed institutional policies, and shifted cultural attitudes about intellectual disability. But the most important change had been within their own family, where fear-based protection had given way to love-based empowerment. Emma had grown from a protected teenager into a confident young adult who knew her own worth and insisted that others recognize it. Harrison had evolved from a father who tried to shield his daughter from the world into a partner who helped her engage with the world on her own terms. "Do you think we'll always be telling this story?" Emma had asked Harrison as they prepared for yet another speaking engagement about their experiences. "I think we'll tell it as long as it helps other families and changes minds," Harrison had replied. "But I also think the goal is to reach a point where stories like ours aren't unusual anymore. When people with intellectual disabilities are fully included in society, nobody will be surprised by a father who's proud of his daughter or a young woman who advocates for herself. I hope that happens someday," Emma had said, "but until it does, I'm glad we can help make it happen faster." In the end, the viral video that had once threatened to define Emma as an object of mockery had instead launched her into a life of purpose, impact, and authentic self-expression. The cruelty that had seemed so devastating had ultimately created opportunities for education, understanding, and transformation that might never have existed otherwise. Harrison often wondered if Sarah would have been proud of how their story had unfolded. He believed she would have been pleased that Emma had grown into such a confident and capable young woman, but he also suspected Sarah might have smiled at how long it had taken Harrison to embrace the inclusive approach she'd advocated from the beginning. "Sarah always knew Emma belonged in the world," Harrison had told Dr. Williams during one of their periodic check-ins. "I'm the one who needed to learn that the world belonged to Emma too." The lesson had taken him 44 years to learn, but once learned, it had transformed not just his relationship with Emma, but his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Success wasn't just about accumulating wealth or achieving professional recognition. It was about using whatever resources and influence you possessed to create opportunities for others to thrive. As Harrison looked toward the future, he saw endless possibilities for the Foundation's work, Emma's advocacy, and the broader movement toward inclusion and acceptance of people with intellectual disabilities. The conversation that had begun with Tyler's cruel video had grown into a national dialogue about human dignity, potential, and the power of community to either limit or liberate individual achievement. Emma's voice had become central to that dialogue, not because she was an inspiration despite her disability, but because she was a thoughtful, articulate advocate who happened to have Down syndrome. The distinction mattered enormously, both for Emma's sense of agency and for the broader cultural understanding of intellectual disability as a form of human diversity, rather than a tragic limitation. The dance that had once been mocked as evidence of Emma's difference had become a metaphor for her right to take up space in the world, to express joy without shame, and to be celebrated for exactly who she was. And in learning to see that dance as beautiful rather than embarrassing, Harrison had discovered that love wasn't about building walls to keep judgment out. It was about having faith that the people you cherish are strong enough to transform judgment into understanding through the simple power of authentic presence. In a world that often seemed determined to diminish people who didn't fit conventional expectations, Emma's story had become a reminder that different didn't mean less. It often meant more. More compassion, more wisdom, more joy, and more capacity to help others see the beauty in human diversity. That was perhaps the most important lesson of all. The people society often sees as needing protection are sometimes the ones best equipped to protect society from its own prejudices and limitations. Emma hadn't needed Harrison to save her from the world. The world had needed Emma to save it from its own inability to see the extraordinary in the supposedly ordinary. And in the end, that was exactly what she had done.